Daredevil Born Again. Not the most divisive of shows Marvel has put out, but one that I have a tough time gauging on an individual basis whether it was received well. Overall, people seem to like it, but always with caveats. I liked this, but there was a lot of wasted filler. This was fun, but also cut off right when it was getting good. Or better yet, whoever edited this did a really good job Frankensteining all those reshoots into something cohesive. Okay, that last one is just my general thoughts, but all those complaints hold true no matter how much enjoyment can be found. Because, like a lot of entertainment, Born Again's got a lot of good and a lot of bad, all mixed together in this patchwork season of television that, in my mind, doesn't work as one seamless story. Sometimes even letting me down in independent scenes and character moments, an area that in the past Daredevil had been known to shine. And I've already talked about my general problems with Born Again Season 1, jumping around from one rant to another, but this is gonna be different. Not just my official thoughts before Season 2 comes out, but an extensive breakdown of exactly what I didn't like, as you could probably tell from the length of this video. Yet I wanted to do this simply because so many moments let me down only because of the potential behind every single storyline these writers were working with. Not a single one of them, in concept, being inferior, but in execution, collapse under lofty expectations and mishandling. So let's shed some light on how, despite the showrunner's best efforts to shove it in our face that he was, Daredevil wasn't born again in this season. Welcome back to Sandwich Reviews. I'm that sandwich guy, your nihilistic optimist, and let's just jump in right at the start with part 1 of this video, the premiere. Opening up with the top and bottom of the screen unlocking and widening to not just kick off the episode, but to reinstate this Daredevil, as if he'd been shut off, momentarily brought back here and there, but now is back, bigger and better than ever. Further proving that with well-composed and deeply saturated shots of the New York we'd get to know over the course of the season, slowly dissolving between them to underline the time that has passed since we were last here in Daredevil's world. And there's only one way to describe the city. It might be a bit of a cliche, but New York is alive. Moreover, giving me the sense that it always was and always will be, no matter what villainous plot is looming overhead. But before there's time to sink your teeth into that juicy bite of themes, the OG3 step out of their office and begin their nightly walk to Josie's, cutting between their friendly conversation to show some locals. And maybe it's just because I was hungry as I rewatched this, but I always want to try one of those hot dogs whenever a hot dog cart is shown on screen. And I've never had one. I don't live in a big city, and maybe they're terrible, but I just really want one right now. Anyway, we get to Josie's bar and the music kicks in with The Future Starts to Slow by The Kills, which on surface level could spark a whole discussion on the meaning behind its pick, but I'll just let you read the song's title to glean the hidden depths behind it. But it's here in Josie's bar that the stylish and polished intro continues on, introducing characters, ideas, and lofty motifs that the season will attempt to cover. I'll have words to say about Cherry specifically, but I'll save it, because for now, even he's good, expositing how he's quitting the force for all the crap he gets, and how vigilantes are doing the same good, but aren't restrained by bureaucracy. A phenomenally complex theme that I presume is going to be discussed more later on, diving into each morally gray facet of the notion. But again, there's no time to think about that. Instead, we get to ruminate on Foggy's fine flirting, with Kirsten McDuffie no less. The comic fans, at least those who've read Mark Waid's groundbreaking run, know exactly what I'm talking about. But here, Foggy calls his, Matt, and Karen's firm NM&P, and I don't have anything deeper to say about that line, I just think it's a lot of fun. But we end that fun with Foggy picking up his phone and stepping away, and right as Karen proposes getting new glasses, Matt cocks his head to focus on Foggy's call, and the way they interpret that is so good. I can't believe after all these years, they can still find new and fun ways to depict Daredevil's powers. And using a fisheye lens and a dolly zoom kind of effect along with warped audio is perfect and just feels right, like it belongs in this particular version of Daredevil. Then we see a fly entranced by a dingy light, pot-shotted onto the wall by an unknown assailant. Though if you know anything about the return of this Daredevil, then you'd know who he is. And sure enough, to fix the light, gloves reach up with Bullseye's Target logo, revealing a not quite comic accurate interpretation of the Netflix character. Though even there, Wilson Bethel's Poindexter in a Daredevil costume references the time that pretty much exact scenario played out in 1979's Daredevil 160. Yet this costume is closer than Bullseye had been in the past. I wouldn't have minded if they just hit the ground running with a full Bullseye costume out of the gate, but unfortunately that wasn't on my mind. What was, upon seeing the Target logo on the back of his hand, was the very critical question of, does Target have that trademarked? Or does it have to be the dog too? I suppose it doesn't matter because no one got sued here, but whatever. Matt, Karen, and Foggy are arguing about Foggy's new case, and Matt storms off to go daredeviling about, leading to us finally seeing the acrobatics we've always wanted. Something we'd gotten glimpses of, with Netflix doing a phenomenal job with what they had, but this is Disney budget, maybe with some iffy CG body doubles and smoke here and there, but still with Daredevil using his billy club exactly as it was intended. Nimble, graceful, yet still able to convey the sense that Matt is angry, furiously trying to get to where he needs, only for that anger to double the minute he tells his head to focus. Again with a phenomenal fisheye dolly zoom and distorted audio to communicate what is happening, hearing specks of conversations, car horns, then the cock of a gun, and the end of Foggy's phone call with his client, Benny, uttering the words, "I'm sorry." And if that wasn't enough, we then see Bullseye eyeing a target before donning his mask. Could have used a full-on Bullseye mask, maybe even just a Daredevil costume recolored like the internet wants. Wouldn't even need to explain why, he could just have it, though the explanation is right there, with Poindexter having felt most comfortable under the guise of a Daredevil costume, and his Bullseye costume being the closest he'll get to that purpose again. But nah. Though I do like how this feeds into the narrative of Poindexter slowly becoming a costumed villain, transitioning from the somewhat socially inept serial killer we saw in season 3 to the ruthless, unstoppable force we see in the comics. But I think I just really wanted to see Bullseye and not a proto-Bullseye. But we're not even really there yet. We're still at Matt trying to run back the way he came, realizing he'd just left the spot where all the action was about to go down, and knowing he'd never make it back in time. So Foggy is shot, and there's nothing Matt can do about it. Of course, some cannon fodder rush out to get shot as well, leaving Karen the only one without a bullet hole. Then we see a great backlit shot of Bullseye walking forward, obscured by the light, and I guess Poindexter just wanted to shoot Karen with a more personal bullet to the head, rather than one sniped from afar, but he never gets the chance, with Daredevil swinging in to kick off the one-shot. And what is there even to say about the one-shot? A lot. There's actually a lot to say about this. But let's back up a sec. Because lately, I've heard a lot of complaints about one-shots. Complaints I can't really argue against. That no matter the technical prowess, because of how sensational the one-shot idea has become, the tactile nature of them has diminished. Where we, the audience, are no longer invested in the character drama, the very reason for a oneer, but are instead thinking about the behind the scenes of it all, entirely taken out of the narrative. But I will always be impressed with a oneer, and the only thing that would make me dislike one is bad thematic reasoning or terribly obvious stitches between the takes. The second of which, this opening oneer does creep into, but I'm willing to give it a pass just because of how much the "we're back" feeling it injects into my veins, where the camera casually wanders back and forth, framing Daredevil and Bullseye going at it, as well as reminding the audience of what's actually important. Following that up by shutting some glass doors and depicting some shadows brawl before they crash through, and Bullseye hitting as many people with strays as he can, presumably caving someone's cheek in with a pool cue, is insane. However, why Daredevil's wonders work so well, and why this Daredevil is almost synonymous with them, visualized here is how exhausted both of these guys are, perilously attempting to gasp in air to muster the strength for one more punch, only to then slump against the wall and wearily have to repeat that a half dozen more times, grounding the ridiculous action in gritty realism, because Daredevil can see in a full 360 around him while flipping around like a ballerina, but he still gets tired, just like everyone else. Plus, it's around here that we see Bullseye lumbering up some stairs, murking everyone in his way, then he turns around, and we get to see Daredevil from the villain's perspective, as a frightening demon approaching to enact vengeance. Of course, 10 seconds later, Daredevil ends up looking like a pincushion, more knife than man, but seeing their knockdown drag-out brawl all the way up to the roof is entrancing, with pure fury in Poindexter's eyes once he finally makes it there. And even if he CG doubles or smoke can't take away from how brutal it is. I even remember a VFX breakdown for this scene coming out, and seeing how that last layer of smoke and darkness just pissed all over the clarity and color the cinematographer put work into capturing, and without a doubt, I obviously wish they hadn't chosen to do that, but I still enjoyed this one take a lot. And to then see Foggy holding on for his dear life, tilting back up to Matt holding on to the man responsible, makes the next scene so tense, because you know Matt has spent seasons of his life clinging to his lapsed Catholic humanity, seeing the murder of another by his hands as the worst sin he could commit. And for those even more in the know, having combed through every frame of the trailer and had predicted something akin to what's about to happen, or at least some form of Zdarsky's first arc, then you're just waiting for the moment that Matt snaps. And sure enough, Poindexter smiling and patting Matt on the shoulder is what puts him over the edge, as he elects to push Dex over the edge, hitting the ground after a jaw-dropping pulled-out wide shot of him falling to the asphalt below with a definitive splat, resulting in an incredible moment where Karen, who's not too far off from the fallen body, looks back, desperate she's not going to find Matt behind her. And after breathing a sigh of relief that it was Poindexter and not her on-again, off-again fling, we go back to Matt, who has lost it, now having stepped over the line he desperately fought to stay behind. So wet with tears, Matt takes off his mask and drops it, no longer Daredevil, launching right into the opening credits of a city and statues familiar to us but are knocked down, crumbled to pieces, only for those pieces to stay alive, forming back together until that city and those statues are whole again, stronger than ever, all building to an undeniably great opening. Not flawless, but hey, what is? Allowing for this opening to set up so many interesting plot points for the season to explore, wrapped in an expository action scene that doesn't feel expository, where we get to see Bullseye back. Whatever surgery he had at the end of season 3 to fix his shattered spine doesn't matter anymore. Did it just allow him to walk again, or did it give him the slightly enhanced strength and speed he has in the comics? It doesn't matter. None of it does. Because everyone's just back. Some time has passed and people have just been living their lives. Yet, with Born Again, I already have 3 major problems. The artificial CG smoke and darkness is an issue, just not a major one. My first legitimate issue being with the season-long story, and the other 2 being more plot holes or personal grievances. But that first one is very damning, because for this to be the story of Matt Murdock quitting his vigilante life and thus having to reignite his daredeviling passion and purpose doesn't play nearly as well as it should, when this is the 3rd time this particular Matt has gone through that exact scenario. Once during Defenders, with that being his whole arc, and once more in season 3, where, just to remind you guys who forgot, they did Born Again, definitively. And I'm not ragging on the name of this show, the title actually makes sense for a new format, but to actually take a cue from that name and essentially redo that arc is just too similar to well-worn ground. But I'll get into that more later on, because we got the other 2 problems I hinted at, that being how Bullseye survives, demolishing any realism and deflating Matt's decision to quit, given he didn't actually cross his line, and Foggy dying, which I just don't buy for a second. Now, when I argue these two, I might come off as contradictory, wishing for more realism when it comes to Bullseye, but less for Foggy. Yet when it comes to Matt's best friend, I just refuse to accept that he's gone. If I had a nickel for every time Foggy was believed to be dead in the comics, I'd only have 3 nickels, but that's enough for me to be confident he's not actually dead.
I'm in denial.
Though any return of his would diminish Matt's decision to quit even further, with his friend's death being the only legitimate reason he has to quit in my eyes. But here we pick up 1 year on, and Matt's got a new schwanky apartment. I miss his old one, but this is thematically nice. And we hear the news talking about how terrible the mayoral candidates are, one being a comedian. But Matt turns it off. I mean, it doesn't matter, right? But as it happens, we now see Fisk. At first eating his usual omelet, with the camera tilting upside down and striking ominous music. But my one question is, how is this guy out of jail? If I'm remembering right, Echo doesn't really explain it, and neither does this. And adding this to the pile of stuff that doesn't matter has a little bit more pain to it, but I guess we'll just have to, because next we see a creepy painting. An interesting one. Somewhat as interesting as these mob bosses convening to discuss financials. And Daredevil's no stranger to scenes like this, yet there's something flat about this one. Clean, synthetic, and lifeless. But Fisk drops in and interrupts the manufactured meeting, causing everyone to crap themselves and promptly leave, allowing Fisk and Vanessa to have a heart-to-heart where Fisk can explain where he's been while recovering, not really saying much on what he's been doing, but ending the scene by saying he's going to run for mayor, so context can be gathered, later clarifying how, while he may not want to deal with government bureaucracy, will do anything he can to cut out the cancerous vigilantes he sees in New York. Then, of all things, we get the BB report, which I have mixed to negative thoughts on. On one hand, it's a relative of Ben Urich delivering a news report where we get to see New York locals talking about their perspective. But on the other hand, it just has the locals say their perspective, not shown to us, just told. But oh well, it's not like they're gonna use it twice in the first episode. Anyway, Matt walks into his nice new firm, which he runs with Kirsten McDuffie, further establishing how outwardly picturesque Matt's new life is, but is hollow. And despite going chronologically so far, I'm gonna jump around a little bit, so stay with me. But especially with Heather, we experience Matt's hollowness, and they're initially parent-trapped into a date, and Matt's instantly rude, but after some surface-level small talk, the music drowns out their conversation as if to say, no, they're getting along. Yet at the end of the episode, Matt pays more attention to the news that Fisk is mayor than his new date, which could have and should have been telling of how doomed their relationship was. Not satisfying to see, but interesting. Nevertheless, moving back to where we were in the episode, Matt heads to Benjamin Poindexter's hearing. Again, how is this guy alive? But I haven't clarified that I'm very glad he is. Not only is Bullseye an integral Daredevil villain that I want to see interact with every character possible in as much as possible, but Wilson Bethel's portrayal is just enthralling. All he has to do is sit there and smile, and he's terrifying. But during his hearing, Karen waltzes in, and on the stand, Matt opens up with a shred of his pain over his lost friend, leading to him and Karen attempting to hash things over, in time resulting in an argument, where Matt restates he's done being Daredevil, saying a line about his new life away from it that stuck with me. It may not help, but it won't make things worse. But Karen gives Matt his chipped Daredevil horn, the ultimate trump card, triggering Matt to angrily cook in the dark, listening with a fantastic distorted audio to Fisk announcing his mayoral candidacy, as if underwater but clearing when the camera eventually pans over to the TV, once more finding new fun ways to depict Daredevil's powers. And we also get a scene to introduce Mr. Gandolfini Jr., who I can't help but feel would have gotten his skull crushed within a week. And though he may have also been shown earlier, I'm honestly not sure, we also see Buck, who, if you didn't already know, is Buck Cashman, as in Bullet. which probably doesn't mean anything to you, and he does look substantially different from his comic counterpart, but is a notable mercenary in Daredevil's Rogues. Not known, but unexpectedly fun to see. But that scene gives rise to another BB report, spelling out the two different sides of how the public view Fisk's brutality, but doing it in the laziest way possible. Thankfully though, Matt doesn't want to mess around, and seemingly neither does this show, because Fisk and Matt sit down to have a conversation in a diner, and they're never waited on, but their dialogue is captivating nonetheless, explaining that Fisk has lost weight and gained muscle, and referencing his past mentee, and how she shot him in the head, making me think that Daredevil maybe needs to mentor his own prodigy, but overall, establishing how they've both come up in the world. Naturally, Matt just wants to make sure Fisk is staying legal, but one mention of Foggy and Matt lashes out, saying he'll stop the Kingpin if he ever comes out again. And Fisk strikes right back even harder, declaring he won't tolerate any costumed vigilantes, and that if Matt ever went back to his activities, he would regret it. And including much more, this is all such an amazingly tense yet amusing scene that breaks the tension by bringing up a confusing plotline from the past, but maintains an uneasy air between the two. Not as viscerally intense as what we've gotten in the past, but compelling. And later, after veritably winning the election, Fisk celebrates his new win, forever altering his dynamics within the politics of New York and the New York underground. Or at least it should. But during Fisk's inauguration speech, he promises to clean the city, and fortuitously, it cuts to someone painting a mural, which is also intercut with Heather and Matt talking, where she says yet another line that stuck with me, how Matt can't carry the weight of the city on his own shoulders, and that New York also just doesn't give a fuck. Apologies for the cuss word, but I do love how, while hinting at Muse no less, the show reminds its audience how mature it is. And after an uncomfortably long shot of Fisk saying, "I love New York," it pans out of Muse painting his latest topical mural, zooms in on Fisk's back as he looks down on what is now officially his city, and finally ends on dual shots of Matt captured in stellar red lighting walking through the chaotic streets, and Fisk standing above it, ready to capitalize on that chaos. And we have reached the end of Born Again's premiere episode. Don't worry, I won't spend this much time on the rest. But I just wanted to take an exercise in really carefully examining this premiere, simply because it sets up so many fascinating ideas ready to be explored in subsequent episodes, along with already leaving me with numerous issues and unanswerable questions, such as sterilely clean streets and not making the best of the scenarios the writers have created. But I mainly just remember being beyond excited to see what was in store with Fisk cleaning up New York, establishing in the first episode that he would take out its vigilantes, meaning that would surely pay off, at least by the finale. But I've wasted enough time. Let's get into Part 2, the Trial of the Century arc. Now, I remember seeing this storyline hinted at early on in a trailer and already losing my mind. With this, not just adapting Trial of the Century, altering it here and there, yet keeping the central storyline, but knocking it out of the park. As a dumb comic fan, I would have liked to have seen superhero testimonies, maybe with Stephen Strange discussing the magic of White Tiger's amulet, but that's my one issue. And that doesn't even count, given the show says, "I'll do you one better," and gives the trial character witnesses from White Tiger's ground level work, making much more sense for what they're going for. But to get there, we see Hector Ayala rushing in to stop what appears to be some kind of shakedown, and this is something I do love to see. I'll cover this more in depth in the next part of this video, but for now, I'll just say there's something inherently interesting about seeing a superhero without their suit and gear, finding themselves in situations where they can't help but do some superheroing in secret, maneuvering around the situation to keep their identity hidden, though Hector doesn't really do that in this scene. And unfortunately, the situation Hector butts into happens to be a tricky one involving sketchy informants and crooked cops. And after an inevitable tussle, one of those cops gets flattened by an oncoming train, and Hector is blamed, tarnishing his name with the label of cop killer. And naturally, I could have used an introductory scene of Hector Ayala actually living his life, going through the motions, and then walking into that subway station, but he's established as a vigilante in the first episode, so I can't be mad there. And in custody, he becomes the target of brutality and prejudice, so I'm immediately on his side, but especially bonded to him once Hector starts talking about the singing frogs from his home, and just how romantic of a thought it is and how painfully it's used later on. But then, without overstating, just seeing the relationship Hector and his wife have pushes a relatable everyman aesthetic onto him much smoother than anything they did with Vanessa and Fisk. With this relationship being strained, presumably due to Hector's need to go out and play dress up as a hero, while he's still a good and caring partner. A dichotomy that only the best of superhero properties have had the balls to go near, but one that is masterfully crafted between the lines of this arc. Plus, I'm a big fan of the dynamic between him and Matt, with Matt choosing to represent Hector because it's the right thing to do, but mainly because he can't help but deflect his pain onto others and make it all about them. You know, the classic tortured hero's demand to protect everyone around them above all else, before ever thinking to look internally and do some personal work. With Matt even walking next to a church, listening in on their sermon, just ready to pounce at the opportunity for a monologue about faith and corruption with some priest, but doesn't. Regardless, Matt persuades McDuffie and Cherry to assist in the case, which takes some convincing, but they help. And here, I want to take a quick detour to move to the Cherry corner. By the way, is it Cherry or Sherry? I feel like they pronounce it interchangeably, but I've been sticking with Cherry. Anyway, I may not be that fond of him, but I don't dislike Cherry. In fact, if simply substituted in with Mahoney from the Netflix days, literally just slotted in and replaced line for line, no one would have had a problem. Sure, it would have made the retiring cop character seeing Daredevil unmasked as Matt Murdock in the premiere way more impactful if it was Mahoney, making it a known character who we'd seen interact with Murdock and Daredevil in the past, with him likely having plenty to say and do in that situation, rather than the forgettable interaction we got with a newly introduced detective who supposedly was there all along, but I guess we just didn't see him. But Cherry lives up to his name. I honestly don't even know what kind of joke I'm trying to make there. Am I trying to say Cherry is a cherry? And if so, what does that even mean? But anyway, Cherry finds the key witness that'll save the case. Nicky Torres, the sketchy informant who Hector stepped in to save. But on his way to see Torres, Matt overhears some cops ready to silence him, and of course, Matt steps in. But after a confrontational conversation, with tensions building, the glimpse of a Punisher tattoo on one of the cops, and Matt's blood dripping onto the floor, which I was sure would come back into play, a brutal brawl ensues. One that has its fair share of quick, jerky cuts that I'm not a fan to see, but with brutality that is still legible, it's not the worst we get, especially when compared to some of the action we get later on, which is barely even comprehensible, but we're not there yet. We're at the fight where Matt straight up kills a cop. Or at least I thought he did at first. I mean, just look at this. He should be in a coma for a month at minimum. But nah, as we'll see in episode 3, the fact that this happened, Matt's anger getting the better of him, beating the ever-loving crap out of a couple cops, just doesn't matter. Maybe that one cop suspects Matt is Daredevil, but nothing like that is addressed. And the one time Matt is confronted about the situation in the bathroom, all that happens is the cop saying, "Blind lawyer who can fight, huh?" I mean, they both have dirt on each other, so I guess it makes sense that it all stays hidden, but for that plot point to be immediately solved was incredibly anticlimactic, yet might be telling for some plot points in the near future. In any case, I've spent long enough not talking about the case, so let's get into it. And if you couldn't tell, unlike for the premiere, I'm doing quite a bit of jumping around, and I'll rewind in a minute to talk about Fisk in this section, but for now, that brings us to episode 3. The trial, where every cop in the district shows up to create this wall of intimidation bearing down on Hector and the jury. What's more, the public defender going against Matt and McDuffie is Dawned the Hawk. and he's based on a minor lawyer in the comics, but it is just so much fun to see small bits of personality and world building injected like that. And after doing a whole 3-card Monty shell game trick with Sherry and another one of Matt's PI guys, cleverly switching which car Torres was in, he makes it to the trial. Yet after all that trouble, as it happens, the cops got to Torres and he commits perjury, lying that he was never there at the subway station. So instead of being an open and shut case of crystal clear he said, she said, Matt's hand is forced and he must use his final play, outing Hector as the White Tiger and hoping that convinces the jury of his heroic principles. Yet even if that Hail Mary works, Matt tells Hector that he must stop being the White Tiger once it's all said and done. But to Hector, that would be like asking him to stop breathing. It's his calling, a higher purpose. Not chosen by him, but for him. And Matt asks once more, but begrudgingly lets the subject go, reminded of a familiar stubbornness. But back in the courtroom, we see character witnesses from occasions of White Tiger saving civilians, even reading police reports of past incidents where White Tiger assisted officers in the line of duty, establishing a way of life where Hector, time and time again, would put himself in harm's way to do the right thing, all while being protected by his magical amulet, which gives him enhanced strength and speed. The usual. And side note, I really love how the MCU can give us genuine courtroom dramas and mention magical amulets without making everyone laugh. But moments like that only work because of the legitimate tension created by the back and forth of speeches and cross-examinations. And the Hawk makes a really good closing argument that as much as Matt McDuffie can prove how unequivocally good Hector is, that doesn't mean he isn't incapable of doing bad, and how inherently wearing a mask and being a vigilante is a secretive and violent profession. Though the Hawk also loses me for a second by talking about how much pain the squished cop went through when he apparently didn't immediately die. And I don't know, man, it really looked like he got pulverized in a matter of milliseconds, but I'm no doctor. Be that as it may, by the time we got to everyone's closing arguments, I wasn't sure what the verdict would be. There was a chance they would just follow the comic, but they'd already taken some liberties, and I had a feeling they'd want to skew this adaptation slightly more positive. So instead of being found guilty, the show gives Hector 1 day of happiness and acquits him of all the charges. And seeing Hector's teary-eyed expression as he hears the good news is so heartwarming. For context, this is my 3rd time watching this season, and this go around I'm taking lots of notes looking down and up from my laptop to the TV, and even then, this managed to get me a little choked up. But as you could probably guess, Hector goes back to what he loves, his calling, not caring that his identity is now public knowledge. And to see him so viciously shot in the head by a Punisher fanboy just hurts. Not entirely shocking, because comic Hector gets a similar fate after being charged as guilty, but man, it just sucks to think about the injustice of what was done to Hector, causing me physical pain, and to then compound that pain further by playing the singing frogs from Hector's home in the credits? Who hurt these writers? To be clear though, I do mean the good kind of pain, with a well-written natural scenario resulting in an injustice you're desperate to see rectified. And especially when compared to some of the other stuff seen in the Trial of the Century arc, all that courtroom stuff just gets better and better. Though that's more of an indictment of the other stuff and less of how good the trial itself is. But hey, I like courtroom dramas, sue me. Yet with the tragic end to episode 3, we can progress to the last episode in this arc, where Hector's niece gets some focus, possibly to become another White Tiger down the line, but for now, simply wants to see her uncle. Thankfully though, Matt manages to stop her, because that would have been an emotionally scarring sight to see. But on his way out from another storyline I'll address later on, Matt finds an opportunity to confront the one cop he knows could be responsible for killing Hector. And he may have tampered with his witness, but he truthfully says he didn't have anything to do with the White Tiger's death. So Matt takes it into his own superpowered hands and solves the case of the missing bullet casing, one with a Punisher logo. And likely keeping tabs on him 24/7, Matt elects to go and ask the real Punisher if he knows anything. And how could you not love Jon Bernthal's Punisher? I love how he's so lost and alone, yet has this focused purpose that drives him. I love how it seems like he's ready to snap at any moment. I love how he instantly cuts to the heart of the issue in this conversation, making Matt cry. Maybe I'm in love with Jon Bernthal's Punisher. I should probably tell my fiancé. Anyhow, most of all for this scene, I enjoy how Frank says he doesn't have time for Matt's candy-ass hero crap, yet that's all he does. But after some more emotional toiling on Matt's end, he goes up to his building's roof to look at all his different suits, all kept in a supposedly confidential shed, I guess. And as Matt plays with his old toys, the scene is intercut with Fisk eating a nice fattening dinner with a captive audience. Which brings us to what Fisk has been up to, setting up his whole Red Hook port thing. And it's also lazily exposited at us that Fisk is watching the trial closely, but not organically depicted. Yet again, following the classic film rule, tell, don't show, with even more BB reports about what the locals think and some uninspired therapy sessions. However, both of which easily could have worked. BB for reasons that I've already covered, though I am glad she's an actual character with more stuff to do later on, and Heather having this connection to every dangerous figure in the city, allowing for some dramatic irony or tension, but is never capitalized on, only ever using her plot lines to discuss superficial stuff I'm not interested to hear in the first place. With the show overall just finding way too many ways to have the characters just state what they want and what they're thinking, rather than showing us with their actions. For Vanessa and Fisk specifically, as if the showrunners wanted them to be in a strained relationship that needed to be built back up again to be stronger than ever, which in concept, paralleled with everything else going on in this season, could have been phenomenal, but the showrunners didn't want to write too many conversations between the two. So a narrative device was used to force those dialogues. Except when the audience can tell it's forced, that's when it just doesn't work. Fortunately though, the political bureaucracy stuff with Fisk is considerably more interesting, with him publicly talking about how New York doesn't need freaks playing dress up, and once again promising to get rid of them. Yet we are given a reason as to why he's unable to act on those promises because of all the protocol and red tape he must follow. And after talking about a figure who helped build the city, looking up to how he got his hands dirty for the people, Fisk makes it clear he wants to change his image to be seen as a builder. Also, I don't know why it's taken me this long to mention her, but I do love Fisk's campaign advisor. Such an interesting character in a horrible position, who is seen constantly attempting to rein in Fisk, maybe even be a friend to him, but is proven to be on the wrong side of history. And I remember making this point in my thoughts on the premiere or my full review for Born Again, but you know what? I still hold the same opinion, because I think Fisk getting out of his car to make some construction guys fill a sinkhole is dumb. Like everything else, it could have worked, with there being something legitimate to say about how Fisk only ever saw the problem because it caused him an inconvenience, and that it was solved to fix his troubles, or how Fisk was happy to cut through all that bureaucratic red tape, forcing those construction workers to get off their lazy butts. Yet, that was only the case because they were presumably waiting for a civil engineer or someone qualified to inspect the plans and make sure everything was sound. You know, the same reason why Adam Eve got in trouble for making a park. But while I'm on Fisk, I also gotta quickly cover Gandolfini Jr. You know what, that's actually mean to reduce him like that. I'll call him Daniel Blake, his name in the show. And I really like the moment where Blake admits he's not even sure how he got there, but he lets BB in for an interview, and this is where he should have gotten his skull crushed. Then, he allows some sensitive information to get leaked, and I don't know how he survived past that, aside from maybe Fisk seeing him as a son. And of course, slightly still on the topic of Fisk, there's this commissioner who does eventually get his skull caved in, but we're not there yet. Because in getting there, I wish he was more of a character. He still has something, being slightly dirty, but having a moral spine, calling out Fisk for what he truly is. Not someone who loves to protect his city, but a whiny child who wants everyone to like him. Or maybe be afraid of him, I'm not sure, and is the one who brought back the Kingpin side of Fisk, forcing him to blackmail the commissioner while eating one of my sandwich brethren. Yet like everything in this show, this storyline never really becomes anything, but that discussion's for later, because we've reached part 3, the bottle episode. Clearly a hangover from pre-reshoots, but something I am so glad was kept. I know it might be divisive, but I liked it. Hell, I loved it. And one thing I enjoy in superhero media above all else, divorced from Daredevil entirely, is just seeing superheroes in their civilian identities, finding themselves in sticky situations and needing to maneuver their way around them. And to get that, we're given the unimportant but still somewhat connected episode with interest.
I'm doing a bottle episode.
Starting out with a fun reveal of Miss Marvel's dad, Yusuf Khan, who has a fun moment of threatening that a leprechaun might beat Matt, though Matt prefers to do the beating. And like any good dad, Mr. Khan can't help but boast about his daughter, who's off visiting friends in California. But in seeking to get his loan approved, Matt doubles down on his life, believing he's doing the right thing in taking on the clients that need him in a legal capacity, in place of beating the crap out of those responsible. But he gets his loan denied, and on his way out, he hears something interesting and has to go back in. And here we see some Irish guy who was set up earlier. Nevertheless, he never really gets a name, so I'm just gonna call him Irish Guy, or Irish Dude for short. And as Irish Dude's crew comes in, one hero bystander steps up, but is taken down right away, leaving the entire room hostile. The perfect place for an undercover superhero, leaving us with the classic bank heist plot. The robbers have inside information, but it instantly goes off plan, and they have to improvise, which is already an interesting meal, but then you spill some Matt Murdock onto that, and you got one nice delicacy, or at least the recipe for one, featuring Matt and Mr. Khan teaming up, given that Matt can sense and understand everything, so he comes up with a plan to keep Khan alive. And outside, Detective Angie Kim, one of the good ones, negotiates pretty well, managing to come up with a joke good enough to stall Irish Guy later on. But initially she gets 2 hostages released, one of which, by any means necessary, cannot be Matt. So naturally, he lawyers his way into staying, impressing Irish Guy with his orphan origin from Hell's Kitchen, leading to a scene I will always require when seeing hostage situations in movies and TV. The hostages bonding, of which we don't see much of, most of which is just to set up the reveal that this lady was actually in on it, but I do appreciate how everyman this guy was. And what's more, he's seen in the next episode, so when referring to him, he can graduate from random older guy to power washer technician guy. But after talking to them in his usual power pose, Matt uses the lousiest, most cliched excuse ever, saying he needs to go to the bathroom. I mean, what if one of the other hostages had to go to the bathroom as well? Would he have just waited for an opportune moment to present itself? But his lackluster plan works, and as Khan stalls, Matt silently beats up the one guy who went with him, barely scraping by, but as always, succeeding just in the nick of time. And I've seen some issues with this or the other fight scene in this episode, and how they might skew any sense of Daredevil's power leveling, but that's a bit pedantic for my tastes. If 2 or 3 guys were sent with Matt here, the scene would have played out exactly the same, and I would have enjoyed that more, as it would have required more complex choreography. Yet all the writers wanted was for Matt to barely succeed, the same thing every superhero does in a scene with a ticking clock, all to increase tension for drama's sake. But as you could guess, Matt scrapes his way through, knocking out the man holding Khan at gunpoint, and mimics his voice to keep the robbers none the wiser. And here, we see Matt using his powers to do something aside from daredeviling. And similar to how much I enjoy seeing superheroes stuck in their civilian identities, I just like seeing superheroes use their powers in ways we wouldn't typically see them applied. But to pass it off, Matt says his likely overused go-to line when someone sees him committing a daredevilish act.
I'm a really good lawyer.
And to find what the robbers are after, Matt and Khan go the long route, just brute forcing which deposit box their key slips into, one box at a time, giving them time to have a nice chat. Matt reminding himself how much he enjoys helping people in these scary situations, and Khan realizing how much courage he has. Yet Detective Kim can't stall Irish guy forever, and a SWAT team goes in to put a kibosh on the entire thing. But before that, Matt can't help but have some fun, and of course smacking a dude with a cane on his way out. An Irish dude attempts to do a tricky handoff, but Matt's already 5 steps ahead, because subconsciously, he's in daredevil mode. Like a compulsion he has no control over, except he is in control. And not just that, he's got a smile on his face. And to let him out of the building, power wash technician guy steps in and saves the day, letting Matt go through so he can beat some ass. Where Irish guy puts up some fight, I guess he's trained, but he doesn't last long, wrapping up the episode with Matt checking up on Khan. And more than the fun glycerine diamond ending, it's just magical to me how their conversation sets up how Matt's having dinner with the Khans. I mean, Matt's just having dinner with every superhero's family. But all in all, how could you not have fun with a standalone adventure like this? With no need for lofty themes and expectations, just having a tight plot and enjoyable characters is all you want to keep the audience happy, at least until the credits start rolling, because then the Twitter nitpickers start coming out of the woodwork. And I pointed out plenty of plot holes or slight problems I had, but in no way does that ruin the enjoyment to be found. At least for this episode, where hidden depths and serialized connections can be seen if you want to read between the lines, but mainly, it's just there to have fun. And on that topic, before moving on to the disappointing and downright depressing stuff, how could I not mention Matt helping out Leroy Bradford, the fiddle-faddle thief? Which may not come off as subtle as some of the other thematic moments I've identified, but in a self-contained and separate adventure, does a great job at showing how broken Matt is and how broken the system is, depicting how, even if justice is being served to the right person, even when the guilty party that's only in the wrong because of their desperation is on the annoying side, the criminal justice system needs to be corrected. And also included in this storyline is Matt flirting with Sophia, the file keeper, having a more interesting conversation and more chemistry than he's had with anyone else. But surely, this is exactly what we want to see from Daredevil. I'm all for serialized, season-long twists and turns, but especially in this prestige TV streaming age, I've grown to really appreciate well-constructed standalone adventures, because when done right, they can establish character dynamics and emotions better than anything overly interconnected, as that comes down to simple interactions rather than a complex web of storylines. But that leaves us at the beginning of the end. Also, don't mind the obvious change in voice. I got a little sick in between, but we're still going. Where so far, we've been making our way through storylines that I view positively, albeit with some nitpicks and dips in quality. However, having passed the halfway point, the show must now begin to wrap things up, and chooses to finalize their serial killer storyline first, bringing us to Part 4, Muse. Who we'd seen glimpses of, teased here and there with some good imagery, but whose reveal is painfully obvious upon seeing him in the first episode. And Hunter Doohan, who I do like as Muse, though maybe with a better script, was cryptically foreshadowed at Heather's book signing. Except everyone and their mom instantly looked at him and thought, well, that's Muse, isn't it? But maybe the writers wanted you to know, creating ample opportunity for therapy sessions between Heather and Muse, filled to the brim with dramatic irony. But nah, we only get one of those. Muse's final appointment, where everything about him, in classic born-again fashion, is just spelled out. Now, I personally think that Muse should have been the main focus of this first season, utilizing a phenomenally freaky villain to establish what kind of world this show is depicting, with Fisk taking more of a back seat until those storylines coalesced and required intervention from Fisk's political maneuverings, explaining why Fisk can be allowed, even enabled at times, to gain more and more power, which is kinda what we ended up with, and was clearly the idea from the writers, but needed way more Muse. Because as it was, he just came off as an afterthought that was thrown in once or twice until he was shoved right in front of our faces, giving me some heavy narrative whiplash. But let's just say that the showrunners got it right, and Muse's storyline really should have been exclusive to episodes 6 and 7, even though we know he should have been more important overall. But let's just say that, well, they still managed to fumble Muse. Because the fact that there was barely any focus on Muse's titular murals is kind of insane. We see a few quickly, but they needed to be implemented throughout, seeing as they're all thematically relevant, and it needed to be more impactful that they were painted from human blood. It was like the showrunners had heard about Muse's blood painting concept and proceeded to throw it in without a second thought simply because it sounded cool. I mean, the scene where Power Washer Technician Guy is telling Fisk about this is played almost for laughs, whereas it should have been ominous and scary. And maybe it's just me, because I am awfully forgiving so long as there's an awe-inspiring antagonist, as we'll see in the next section, but even without that necessary backing, Muse still could have worked easily, with the opportunity for a chilling representation of one of Marvel's comics' most enigmatic serial killers, one who hasn't been seen that much since his introduction in Charles Soule's Dark Art arc, yet was instantly iconic for me. And I'm not even sure what exactly his powers are, but on top of his sensory discombobulating thing, he's an inhuman with enhanced strength and speed. Yet most importantly, has no secret identity, with his comic arc building up to him being revealed as nothing more than a man in a mask that covers up one freaky face, disfigured from his inhuman mutation or something far worse. But as I've already clarified in my top 10 MCU wasted villains video, this live action Muse in no way, shape, or form has to align with his comic counterpart, but to trade out all of that dark ambiguity for a privileged white boy named Bastion Cooper, whose only thought about character trait being that he's a trained fighter, is second rate at best. Because I couldn't tell you a single thing about this guy. He's clearly mentally unwell, using his sadistic art to express his internal unease, but any deeper psychological analysis was ignored. Nonetheless, he does look cool, sometimes. I know his costume isn't universally loved, and it is a bit bulky for my taste, though that does tend to happen with live-action interpretations, but I still like it. Yet at the end of the day, he just either needed to be 1, super creepy, or 2, to say something. And there's a moment later on where a couple fans approach him, which could have been the perfect occasion to bust out some sadistic charisma, something Comic Muse is known for, and would have legitimized his threatening nature while also contextually explaining how the hell he was able to get away with this for so long. Yet he just turns around and looks at them, illustrating how the writers had chosen the creepy first option. However, even with that, with him silent and chilling, he should have come across as animalistic in his body movements or something, covering how he only ever relies on his barbaric intuition, because without dialogue, it all comes down to the physical performance, which still wasn't seen. And just to be clear, this right here is what's truly indicative of everything wrong with this interpretation of Muse, because when given the chance to depict anything, whether that be character-based decisions or just all-around visual storytelling, in this instance, the writers chose to go with nothing. And I am, of course, alluding to the pivotal scene where Muse captures Angela in a terrifying game of cat and mouse through abandoned graffiti-riddled subway tunnels, where Muse slowly stalks her from the darkness, reveling in the terror he instills in his victims. You know, a great moment of tension where, despite knowing Angela will live, given she's gotta make a return in future seasons as the next White Tiger, we're still worried for her. However, as you know, that's not what happened. Simply seeing her enter the tunnels, and next thing you know, she's unconscious draped over Muse's shoulder, ignoring any of the drama or narrative flow required for that to even function, making it clear that the entire purpose of her plotline and her character were only there to force the next thing to happen: Matt becoming Daredevil, the point of this season, leaving that very pivotal moment, what's supposed to be a triumphant return, the same as the picture-perfect life Matt had set up for himself: hollow, flat, and matter-of-factly. But it does give us some cool intercut action, visually showing us that Fisk and Matt have both wound up back in their old lives. So at least there's that. But without it, I'd go as far as to say that Muse's Spotlight episode, at least where the villain is concerned, is straight up bad. And that's without even mentioning the next episode, which is even worse. But before getting to that, there are a few things brought up in this episode that need to be mentioned. Heather and Matt being a terrible couple, though she does make some interesting points about how their world reveres the mask, creating an environment where we are allowed to be stripped of morality, and Matt believes it's more up to the person, something I'm more inclined to agree with, but Heather does make a point. There's also this mob guy who I think was in charge of Irish Dude, but he keeps hassling Fisk, who could negotiate the situation, proving how much he's changed into an upstanding mayor, but only proves that Fisk is the same old kingpin. And Fisk is also seen at a charity event bowing down to rich people, setting up his Red Hook port thingy, and that the swordsman is here in New York, apparently the only other vigilante besides White Tiger. And it's also during that event where we see an uber-rich couple introduced pushing back against Fisk. And I remember jumping up in my seat the first time I saw them, thinking they were the Stromwins, an insanely rich and powerful couple from the comics. And lastly, there's Fisk's anti-vigilante task force, who notably aren't masked. I don't know, I just think it's funny how even Fisk thinks it's cowardly to cover your face, because wearing a mask means you have something to hide. But here we're also introduced to Born Again's Cole North, who, if you didn't know, is a cop from Zdarsky's run that's meant to symbolize the true and noble side of the law that Daredevil needs to convince of his innocence. So at this point I was thinking, okay, the writers are planting someone who's going to organically flip to the good side and be a whistleblower for the task force. Maybe even in future seasons. But no, that's not what North is used for. Anyway, we'll get there. For now, let's go back to Muse and episode 7, Art for Art's Sake, where a lot of legitimately great stuff can be seen, immediately followed up with stuff that was far from it, such as Matt going on an all-around ego trip and confessing how manufactured his life was to Heather, then ending that very same conversation by moving backwards, with them both saying, "I love you," Fisk mentioning how a violent vigilante took down his honest business, which in turn gets the asymmetrical Buck fully on Fisk's side, then after all that time, just turning the character into Wesley 2.0, which he always was, but was set in stone with this, or Fisk hearing that Daredevil is back and having to grapple with that, wanting to instantly begin the manhunt for Matt Murdock, but needing to keep it a Cold War while Muse was still on the loose, then squandering that Cold War premise over the next 35 minutes. But all I really need to talk about is how wasted Muse is, where the writers think they're pulling the rug out from under us with Fisk and the one good cop's conversation, and a penny meaning to drop for Heather, who's now in grave danger, but none of that happens because we are all well aware. And instead of yet another chance for a cat and mouse game, maybe Muse kidnapping Heather and forcing Fisk's Cold War to stall for a little longer, but no, Bastion Cooper just decides to kill his therapist. And he knew the cops were coming because he says not yet when he hears them. But what was his plan here? Heather even calls him out for not having a plan, but that's just plain old bad writing. Yet her call out triggered Bastion to strangle her, and that's when Daredevil busts in. Now, I hyped this fight as choppy and bad, but it has its moments. Like when Daredevil shoots his grapple through Muse's shoulder, proving Heather's violent mask theories right, in a way. way, but in a badass way, yet is anticlimactically and painfully cut short with Heather shooting Muse and killing him for good, as in he's gone, which just hurts. And I have even more thoughts on how Muse is Marvel's most wasted villain, but I've got a top 10 list all about that, and let me tell you, he definitely makes an appearance there, so I'll stop rambling about him. But the task force takes credit for Muse's death, bringing Fisk more power and influence, and in theory, leading right into Part 5, to finale and beyond. I know, everything's different again, but just deal with it. Because there are a lot of things I wouldn't have any issue with if it were addressed in the final arc. Chiefly, Matt going into a church to have a monologue with a priest. In fact, if anything, they should have had him actively avoiding it all season, all for a full-bore one in the finale. Though there is a short conversation with Josie herself at Josie's, and I feel like that is the closest we'll get. But for real, there is an instant change in feel to these last two episodes, most likely resulting from them legitimately being different, because these two, along with the first, were directed by the showrunners, with the rest of the show cobbled together from the scraps of what they had before the reshoots. And somehow, despite the time I've been talking, I haven't brought up the fact that at least 3/4 of this was written and filmed, with it reportedly being more of a lawyer procedural without Karen and Foggy or any of Matt's old life, possibly with them just being killed off screen before the show even started, though I think that one was more of a rumor. But all things considered, those showrunners did a pretty damn good job of cobbling together what they had and making something of it. That's why Matt's suddenly chosen this picture-perfect yet manufactured life, all the while laying the groundwork for ongoing seasons of Born Again, where the writers could make whatever they wanted without restraints. And the optimistic side of me likes to think that even the bad stuff in this season can be retroactively fixed. Yet reshoots or not, because the season should be able to stand on its own, the problem is that Born Again doesn't ramp up any of the reveals it does have to anything earned. Just slowly building up all of this stuff, admittedly really well at times, only to half-heartedly toss out the conclusion. Because, as I've already addressed, here in the final 2 episodes, the show can no longer circle those incredibly lofty ideas, and must actually address them, such as Fisk's anti-vigilante task force, particularly Cole North, being Punisher fanboys. Because Cole North is the most indicative element of this show, being a microcosm for everything else attempted throughout this season, where it's nonchalantly revealed that North is Hector's killer. Almost as if, while doing reshoots, the showrunners just took a dartboard of cop characters in Daredevil comics and went, make Hector's killer him. And putting aside the missed opportunity for an entertaining mini boss fight where Daredevil and Punisher have to team up against North, not even anything major, I'm just talking 30 seconds, their subsequent conversation just becomes nothing, making it the clear necessary narrative that the showrunners decided they needed to include, but didn't plan out at all, wanting to push Daredevil to the edge once again and test whether or not he'd cross his line, but having absolutely zero emotional impact. Plus, we know North isn't going to die. Not even Punisher's gonna kill him, because they still gotta find some way to redeem him. And he's dead. They just killed him. Okay, well, I guess that's a choice. But at least there's some good Punisher action. And seeing Frank, Matt, and Karen together kinda makes me think that their dynamics and incredible charisma should have been what this show was. But Frank's inclusion also leads to another entirely anticlimactic resolution, which takes the elevated concept of arrogant agents of the law neglecting the responsibility they've knowingly signed up for, and diminishes everything about it. Yet again, with ample opportunity to ace that storyline, with the Punisher being forced to sit down and have a chat with said task force, which wasn't terrible, but needed more punch to it, more finalized closure on their conversation. Not necessarily the exact line-for-line comic that we all thought we'd get, but just something to explicitly state that the Punisher isn't a figure to be idolized, and that anyone who did clearly had a screw loose. And I mean, Frank calls them out for being the clowns that they are, but a little elaboration on that would have been appreciated. Then there's Heather, who's going to need a lot of retroactive fixing in season 2, yet is going to be fighting an uphill battle through it all, because I don't think there's a single person who watched this season and ended up liking Heather by the end. And sure, her character is meant to see the worst in vigilante justice, there to play devil's advocate and pose legitimate anti-vigilante rhetoric. Perhaps next season she'll even be able to represent the lawful side of Fisk's psyche, seeing as she's now on his cabinet, but for her to finish this season siding more with Fisk than Matt is ludicrous. At first, merely equating Daredevil with Muse, complaining that they were both emotionally stunted boys getting their violent urges out, and she's not wrong about that, but abruptly goes full throttle onto Fisk's side for no other reason than the writers needed her to, which very well could have gone hand in hand with her doomed relationship with Matt, feeding into her downfall, yet wasn't a priority or a concern to depict in any way, because there was no relationship between the two, and I was constantly thinking about how they just needed to break up, where Matt's actions time and time again proves how little he cares for Heather, and time again she proves how indifferent she is to it all, which might have potentially made her story better if during the pivotal scene of Matt admitting his life with her and everything else felt fake, she had fought back, because that's the only real scene between them, yet is immediately flattened when it is never even acknowledged afterward. Not at the black and white ball, and certainly not when Matt wakes up in the hospital and calls her Karen. And I mean, maybe I missed this entirely on this third rewatch, but they never did break up either. I don't know. I assume in season 2 she's gonna have a lot to reckon with and even be haunted by Muse. Not literally though, sadly. And maybe there a lot of these issues could be addressed, but for a year we were left with this. Nevertheless, these last 2 episodes were clearly focused on Fisk and Bullseye, and this Benjamin Poindexter is just an amazing villain who you love to see. Genuinely, I don't know who I love more, John Bernthal's Punisher or Wilson Bethel's Bullseye, because Bullseye's only negative I can think about is how he didn't go for the head when shooting Kingpin, which left Matt with a gunshot wound that didn't even matter, given he was favoring a side, but still flipping around in the finale like that rifle round to the shoulder was just a love tap. But with Fisk, I've been orbiting around the fact that the writers wanted him to try and be good, legitimately attempting to change the city for the better. But I, nor anyone watching this, believed for a second that he wasn't going to be the Kingpin again. Just like with Matt, you know the turn is coming, which could have been great, but only ever came across as treading water until it was forced to happen. Though Fisk dealing with bureaucracy is amazing. I skipped over it, but him tweaking out when the kids are singing to him and standing up to clap is truly magnificent. But for that to all culminate in his Red Hook port, where he magically has diplomatic immunity to do anything, is just too out there for them to just randomly throw out in the final episodes. With the files that prove all of this, the ones that Foggy died for, all just sitting in storage. And then for Matt and Karen to just go to that port and find 100 task force guys wandering around, it's just all too ridiculous for something that is supposed to be somewhat grounded. And again, could have worked, but after such a slow build beforehand, just too quickly jumps to that ending. We know that there's a bunch of crooked cops from Hector's trial, but we didn't see nearly enough of the cops in general. I mean, what's it like in their department? I imagine things are hostile, and I'd love to see that, but we don't. Instead, we get to see a lot of therapy scenes between Fisk and Vanessa, and including that one mob guy that keeps hassling Fisk, all sets up the disagreements between the two to come to a head, where we might have gotten some intriguing version of Fisk versus Vanessa, but their relationship was never in question, only ever involving that one mob guy constantly being unhappy until he's shot in the head. making it so that by the end, there was only one character that managed to grow on me, somehow getting better as time went on. No, not Buck. That, of course, being Daniel Blake, who, given he could slot in as a Butch-esque figure from the comics, I'm genuinely interested to see in the future. Yet overall, just like most of the other Disney Plus MCU shows, was just overshadowed by a disappointing and anticlimactic finale. One I thought might have been better upon closer examination, but only got worse. That is when Bullseye wasn't on screen, where the entire season was meant to build to Matt realizing his picture-perfect lawyer life wasn't just ineffective, but aggravating, resulting in him, as well as Kingpin, slowly being drawn back to their old violent lives. And in a vacuum, this season is pretty much Matt and Fisk's diner conversation, and I'm more than okay with that, undeniably working moment to moment, and I enjoyed the hell out of this. But by its end, I only thought it was okay, whereas it could've and should've been great, subsequently making a season of TV that has some incredible highs and depressingly painful lows, but for me is so weighed down by those negatives that whenever I think of it, I can only think of those lows, of widespread wasted opportunity and half-assed payoffs. And they didn't have to wrap up everything. Obviously there's gonna be stuff left open, it's only season 1, but the stuff they did choose to wrap up was only ever paid off with a limp thud. All Frankenstein together to create something that constantly tells us that Daredevil is born again, but I'm left unconvinced. But critically, I have yet to discuss New York's lack of heroes. And I know Spider-Man isn't about to show up with too many rights disputes, but can we at least get some other street-level guys? I mean, what of the other vigilantes in New York? Besides swordsmen, that is. They don't even need character arcs or tie-in shows or anything like that. Just popping in to show they do exist would go a long way. Because by not showing up, particularly when it comes to the New York events that would definitely have an effect on them, that makes it seem like they don't exist. Also, remember what I said about not needing tie-in shows? Scratch that, because we needed a Heroes for Hire show yesterday, and we know we're getting the Netflix Defenders back, but for a storyline like this, the more vigilantes, the better. Not just for people to see recognizable characters and go, but to contextualize this story in the world we know, giving consequences to Fisk's actions and making them tangibly real. But as a comic fanboy, can I just say, can we finally get to Devil's Reign with all of New York's lower level heroes getting involved? How much more setup do we need until we just get there? Although the only thing that would make me happy to wait, and it does seem like they're actually doing this, is adapting Brewbreaker's arc, The Devil in Cell Block D, which if done right, could be an excellent season 3. But while I could keep talking about what I want from Born Again's future, I'll call it here. Hell, I had to re-record this section a couple times, so I know this video is gonna be late, meaning I probably should have called it even sooner, but hey, I like to talk about Daredevil. But anyways, thank you so much for watching to the end. It means the world that you even clicked on this video, yet if you're up for it, make sure to leave a like, subscribe for weekly video essays and reviews, though not as weekly if I'm making stuff like this, and as always, enjoy a delicious sandwich.